Hi, everyone. Thanks for joining us for this installment of Dalhousie University's Open Dialogue Live series. I'm Kim Brooks, Dean of the Faculty of Management at Dal. Before we begin, I want to acknowledge this week's tragedy. We're all affected by the losses in Nova Scotia. We're a close-knit community. The Dalhousie community stands with you in this difficult time. As we all find new ways to stay connected, this series is designed to bring weekly conversations to our community featuring Dalhousie experts and focusing on current events. Today's episode will help make sense of the misinformation landscape. Staying up to date with the latest COVID-19 information can be overwhelming. In addition to its pace and volume, and to the multiple sources of information, some of which may be seen to be highly technical and out of the reach of many, there's the challenge of parsing the boring truth from the exciting lie. During the presentations, we encourage you to post your questions online. A little later in our program, we'll have time to talk about some of those questions with the presenters. So let me get to who those people are. Sociology professor and knowledge expert Emma Whelan will discuss trends in Canadian news coverage with a focus on the themes of moral authority, regulation, risk, and responsibility. Welcome, Emma.
Thank you. Nice to be here.
International Development Studies professor and host of the Global Development Primer podcast, Robert Huish, will focus on global health, along with the challenges of getting good information and policy approaches out and the place of international cooperation. It's nice to see you again, Robert.
Hi, Kim.
Finally, Professor Mike Smit, an award-winning teacher and researcher in Dal's School of Information Management, will shed light on the challenges that technology is creating as it allows information and misinformation to be shared at an astounding and sometimes dangerous pace. Nice to see you again, Mike.
We spend a lot of time together these days, Kim.
We do, don't we? I'm going to turn it over to you to get us started, Emma.
Okay, so thanks, Kim, and hi, everyone. So I'm going to focus my remarks today on Canadian news coverage. So some of the trends we're seeing and what I think critical consumers of news media should be thinking about right now. So first of all, why should we care about this? Why should we think critically about media coverage now? Well, our exposure to it has increased during the pandemic. So any effects that it has on us are likely to be stronger now. According to Statistics Canada, 63% of Canadians are watching more TV and 68% are spending more time on the internet than before the lockdown started. And the biggest increase in digital media consumption is in news consumption. So much of the news that we're consuming, of course, is about the pandemic. Canadians are almost 5 times more likely to go to news outlets than government health agencies for information about COVID-19. Now, like many people, I've been glued to my screen since this started, obsessively reading and dissecting the news with my family and my friends and my students. A little shout out to my students in Morality and Health Seminar. We've been talking about this stuff a lot. But also, like most people, I'm in a bit of a bubble. I tend to read the news stories that reflect my politics and interests. I go to particular sources. And of course, that's always been true to some extent, that people have favored certain newspapers or news programs that cater to their views. But we get so much of our news online now, and it's more curated for us than ever before, both because of our clicking behavior and also through websites' algorithms. So if we click on one article, we get links to related articles, or Facebook, based on what it knows about us, puts particular sources or stories in our news feeds. So instead of talking about the news that I've just happened to see, which would be pretty biased, I think, given that I tend to look primarily at kind of liberal left sources, I wanted to try to get out of my bubble a bit and do something a bit more systematic. So I used a news database called Factiva to do an analysis of the top news stories in 3 high circulation Canadian English language newspapers. So the Globe and Mail, the Toronto Star, and the National Post. And in those 3 papers, 85% of the page 1 stories from mid-March to mid-April were about COVID-19. It's been the top story, significantly reducing coverage of any other news. So the public is getting less information about other issues than we normally do. So I decided to look at those 3 papers, not just because they're high circulation, a lot of people read them, but also because they're generally thought to have distinct political biases. And one of the issues that I focus on in my research is the way the media represents health problems as moral problems. So who or what is to blame for them? Who's most at risk? Who's responsible for fixing the problems? So what kind of stories did these three newspapers feature on page 1? How did they configure the coronavirus problem? Could we put the first slide up, please? So I did a focused analysis of 200 page 1 stories about the coronavirus, published between February 27th and April 16th. Here it is, yeah. Now, 200 sources is not a huge sample. That's just what I had time for in the past week. So my findings are really just suggestive. But the top 5 themes in this sample were stories about COVID outside Canada, the pandemic's effects on the economy and business, stories related to coronavirus testing and labs, the experiences of frontline staff and hospitals, and the biggest group of all, stories about seniors, particularly in nursing homes. Second slide, please. Now, when I broke that down by paper, I saw some interesting variations in focus. So the most prominent theme in the National Post, that's the sections in blue, was evaluations of political leadership. So this is primarily criticisms of the Trudeau government. The secondary focus was problems in healthcare institutions and stories about government restrictions and recommendations and the public's response to those, the behavior of the public in response to those. The Globe's most frequent themes, so those are the bits of the bars in red, were the experience of the pandemic in other countries, followed by problems in seniors' care facilities and effects on business. And the Star's most common themes, in orange, were stories on overwhelmed hospitals and healthcare providers, followed by problems with COVID-19 testing and seniors' care facilities. So in the Star, a particularly strong focus on a kind of overwhelmed, under-resourced healthcare system. So different sources seem to reflect different biases in coverage. And because research has shown that Canadians are likely to believe the news sources that they choose to read, these sources can bias their perspectives about what the main problems are, what the main risks are, what to do about them, who's most affected, who's responsible. So for example, there's some interesting differences across sources in stories about restrictions on public behavior. So stories in the National Post tend to be more critical of government-imposed restrictions and recommendations. So for instance, they covered social distance shaming and the rise in state and public health surveillance. And for the most part, they covered it critically. The Toronto Star, on the other hand, published stories that promoted social distancing. They were more critical of individuals who weren't following public health recommendations. So different papers use different frames. That is, they promote different ways of defining the problem and its causes, they encourage different moral judgments about it, and they recommend different solutions. Next slide, please. So news reports about the closure of parks or beaches can be framed positively or negatively. And negative framing is something like exercise is good for public health and the government's restrictions are authoritarian and too harsh. The positive frame might be restrictions are needed because people are ignoring expert public health advice and increasing community spread. The stay the blazes home argument that our premier has been making. Now, both frames are about the same phenomenon. Both can use experts to support their position. Neither frame is what I would call misinformation. And the moralizing in the stories isn't always immediately obvious, but they focus on different risks. Government overreach on the one hand, community spread on the other. And they assign blame and responsibility differently. So one suggests the blame lies with kind of an authoritarian nanny state, and the other with irresponsible, selfish individuals. So I think such differences in frames help us make sense of some growing political divisions around the pandemic. For example, the rallies in the US against government-imposed restrictions. And again, we've seen vastly different, often very moralizing coverage of those rallies. It's likely that the frames used in media sources on different sides of the political spectrum both reflect and help increase the political divisions that in turn seem to feed into such rallies. So recently, Bill Maher, who's obviously himself a liberal, criticized liberal papers like the Post, the Washington Post and the New York Times for publishing what he called panic porn. He argued that whipping up hysteria by exaggerating what is already a crisis, that not only makes people unnecessarily anxious, but it could actually give credence to Donald Trump's charges about fake news and allow Trump to play the optimist about the pandemic. And as Maher points out, optimists tend to get elected. So the liberal media, he's saying, could actually be helping Trump by exaggerating the crisis, whereas, of course, their intent is to criticize Trump's handling of the crisis. And here's another example about how moralizing frames can sometimes backfire. So there's a lot of moralizing coverage about toilet paper hoarding. And that seems to encourage more toilet paper hoarding. People worried that they didn't have enough, that they wouldn't be able to get toilet paper. So that, of course, exacerbated the shortage. I'd say that the issue with reputable news sources generally isn't that one source's coverage is wrong and the other's is right, but that they problematize things differently. And sometimes they even use the same facts. News sources tend to use the frames that their niche markets like, that they're used to, that they agree with. So following only sources that fit our biases can entrench them even further. They can lead us to believe that our values are truths. And that makes us less able to subject those values to critical scrutiny. We become less aware of the way our news is being framed and the moral judgments we're making as a result. So to be critical news consumers, I think we need to do at least three things. First, look for stories that aren't about the coronavirus to get a less lopsided view about what's going on, both in Canada and the world. Two, aim for a variety of reputable sources. And three, think more consciously about the frames those news stories and news sources are using. Play devil's advocate with ourselves and our favorite sources, and get a little less comfortable with our biases in the process. And so one American website I just discovered that seems like it might be helpful with this is called allsides.com. And it publishes side-by-side stories on the same topic from sources across the political spectrum. So everything from the Jacobin to CNN to the National Review. And when you look at that, it makes me much more aware of the frames that are being presented to me in the sources I usually read. So I'd suggest we might consider venturing outside our usual media bubbles, even if we have to stay in our social distancing bubbles, at least for now. And I think I'll leave it there for now. Thanks.
Thanks, Emma. That was fantastic.
Thanks.
You've given us lots to think about, so I hope that folks who are watching are taking some time to type in their questions so we can come back to you later. Certainly from my perspective, you gave me some insight into my own reading. I often read an article about coronavirus or COVID-19 and find myself having an emotional response to it. And I hadn't been able to articulate for myself why that might be true. And so the moral lens, trying to read it through that vantage point, I think will help me in digesting my own consumption about the media we're getting. That takes us to the second speaker for today. I'll invite Robert to join us, and he's going to explain the challenges of getting good information in times like this in its international setting.
Great. Thank you very much, Kim. And thank you, Emma. That's great. Hopefully I can build on some of your points here. And I want to start off by just asking students and alumni who are watching this, have you ever wondered why professors take marks off for not citing your sources or for not using good sources in your essays? The coronavirus pandemic is exactly why. Because viruses take advantage of certain situations. And in global health, we know very well that poorly structured healthcare systems, lack of sanitation, are all key equations, part of the equation. But what we're seeing now in this pandemic is that misinformation is another one of these structures that viruses take advantage of. We know about social distancing. We know about self-isolation and other measures to flatten the curve. But what also matters is being vigilant against lies, misinformation, and deception. So as Emma talked about leans and different lenses within the media, I want to talk about people who just dive straight into the BS department and just lie. The United Nations has labeled it currently an infodemic, where there is too much information, too much misinformation, and too many lies circulating all at once about a particular problem. That's what they define as an infodemic. And the challenge is that it makes it difficult to identify solutions or agreement to solutions for problems. Now, unfortunately, in 2020, the infodemic has spread just as fast as the pandemic itself. Now, infodemics are nothing new. They occur in times of crisis or in conflict, only this time there are no bystanders. All of us are involved. And even despite our incredible advancements in health research, including vaccinology for the COVID-19 pandemic, governments are still relying on ancient methods of public health in order to deal with this crisis. And what I mean specifically is quarantine. Quarantine is something that dates back to the book of Leviticus about separating the ill from the good of society. And that's about 500 BC or so. It's an ancient method about self-isolation and distancing in this way, and it comes with ancient problems, such as stigma. We've heard a lot about that in the news, misinformation, and also dissent from within society. And that's why in this new era of public health, there emerges new challenges, such as misinformation that requires new methods. Now, you may recall in January, images flooded the internet about a bat soup coming out of Wuhan. The image was posted by celebrity blogger Wang Wengyang, and there was just one problem. The video wasn't set in Wuhan at all, where actually bat isn't even much of a delicacy. The video wasn't even in China. Instead, it showed Wang Wengyang and the host of an online travel show eating the dish in Palau, Micronesia, south of a Pacific island nation. Now, sampling the bat was just another one of her methods of this well-trodden adventurism and enthusiasm that she does on her show for unusual foods that we've seen. And that's was reported very clearly by the Financial Post. But the thing is, bats aren't a common food source in Wuhan, and it's contested whether or not the Hunan seafood wholesale market actually sold bat meat. And yet, the UK's Daily Mail and Russian television broadcast that assumption and misinformation worldwide. Now, the question is why? Why misinform? Why not check the sources and check the sources before letting the story fly? Unfortunately, it has been a growing habit in many news outlets where reporters or columnists publish stories or opinion pieces without proper fact checking, let alone making an effort to contact knowledgeable persons in the know. So why misinform or lie in the first place? Why do people lie? I mean, are they just jerks? Sometimes, yes, they are. But often people misinform because it's in their interest to do so. And this is to say, it's in the simplest sense that people lie for two major reasons: in order to take advantage of a scenario or to avoid consequence. So if someone is spreading misinformation, it likely winds back to one of those two reasons for doing so. So in this infodemic, the question then is, why is this information being told? What is its intent? Who takes advantage? To whose advantage? And who's trying to avoid consequence? Or is it about maintaining health and well-being? Like, in what ways are we hearing information? Is it the information we're hearing, is it really for someone's advantage? Is it to avoid consequence? Or are we being told information for our own well-being? Unfortunately, we're in a state where we have to ask these questions, not just of news sources, but also of world leaders themselves. It's not the first time that disinformation has been used in times of a global health crisis to take advantage of others. If you go back in the history books, Cold War history, you may learn about Operation Infection, and that's spelled with a K. That was set up by KGB operatives in the Soviet Union in the early 1980s to intentionally spread disinformation about the HIV/AIDS crisis in the 1980s. The Soviet method of disinformation was actually pretty simple, and it followed this sort of pattern, which we can see can be repeated in today's social media environment. Propaganda and disinformation would first appear in a country outside of the USSR. It'd be planted in a news story or an op-ed or maybe a conference proceeding. And only then it would be picked up by a Soviet news agency itself, which attributed it to others' investigative journalism. And that the story came from a foreign source, not widely known to be Soviet controlled or influenced, that only added credibility to the allegations, especially in impoverished and less connected countries, which generally could not afford access to the Western news satellite feeds. Now, this happened frequently in India and in Ghana, where the Soviet Union maintained a large propaganda and disinformation apparatus for covert media placements. Now, in the case of Operation Infection, it was to plant a report by a Bulgarian scientist that the US secretly engineered the AIDS virus, and that this was during a time when Soviet scientists themselves were reaching out to American scientists for help in understanding the virus. So that's the idea about intentionally spreading misinformation. Now, aside from the James Bond tactics here, misinformation from government is, well, rampant on a global scale. According to the Washington Post fact checker, President Trump has made 16,421 lies or misleading statements in the first 3 years of his presidency. Now, that's about 15 a day, or more than one every other hour. During the pandemic, the misinformation from the United States, and particularly the White House, not the CDC, but the White House, has been enormous. From access, the president talking about access to tests, to timelines, to dismissing the virus as a flu, to saying that it was the previous administration's fault. Other conspiracy theories have trickled up. They've emerged about this being a strategic bioweapon. US Senator Tom Cotton and Francis Boyle, a law professor, claim the virus to be a bioweapon from China. Conspiracy theories have run wild around the world as well. In Iran, Sayed Mohammed Sidi accused US President Donald Trump of targeting the city of Qom with coronavirus to damage the culture and honor of the country. On January 26, Chinese military news site Shilu published an article detailing how the virus was artificially combined by the US to precisely target Chinese people. In the Philippines, Senator Tito Soto played a bioweapon conspiracy video in February 2020 in the Philippine Senate hearing suggesting that the coronavirus was a bioweapon war from China. And Jair Bolsonaro claimed that COVID-19 would not be a problem for Brazil. In Venezuela, Constituent Assembly member Elvis Mendez theorized that the virus was a weapon against Latin America and that its purpose was to demoralize and to weaken their system. There's been anti-Muslim sentiment and violence. It's been reported violence in India, and in Iran, media has blamed Israel for engineering the virus. So again, why lie? It's a reflection of a rather horrible state of international affairs. It reflects how the international system is structured to respond to enemies rather than problems. And unfortunately, there are a wide range of populist leaders in charge during this pandemic, leaders who rose to power by sowing division, sowing fear, and sowing tension, rather than raising to their status and power through cooperation and understanding. And again, back to turning in assignments to your professors. If you submit work that lays blame through broadside accusations with no merit, you'll probably get a terrible grade. If you write your papers about problems and ways to understand and approach the problem, you'll often do well on the paper. So why do we misinform? Why do people misinform? It's because these political leaders see it as a way to either take advantage during the crisis or to deflect blame. And unfortunately, this behavior gets picked up quickly across social media platforms. Facebook and Twitter are now scouring their services to remove false medical information. WhatsApp has limited forwarding of messages to slow the spread of the disinformation. And Amazon is working to remove the sale of any goods that claim to be a cure for COVID-19. So much like the Soviet engineering, the seed is planted and then the information system itself carries it. It is why the way forward through this crisis requires vigilance against misinformation, rather than just vigilance against the virus itself. In Vietnam, case reporting has been centralized so as to avoid competing or misinformation on statistics. Daily briefings from public health officers around the world are important in being able to share the latest data, but also in keeping the message clear and consistent. And internationally, the sharing of good information is essential so that countries can be informed on best practices and strategies for handling the pandemic. Reporting has been done carefully so as to be truthful, and also to be mindful not to fuel any misinformation or stigma against populations. Racial attacks have been reported in the United States, the United Kingdom, and across Canada, especially in the city of Vancouver, reporting over 100 cases of hate-driven crime, including one yesterday against a 92-year-old man who was physically thrown out of a convenience store. So I'd just like to wrap up by saying that misinformation on a global scale is about disjuncture in politics. When leaders lie, as they have during the pandemic, it is for some opportunity or advantage. So how do we move away from these during time and working against a common problem? We can't do it through policies of fear and total isolation, either within or between borders. Rather, it needs to be about exploring a new politics of cooperation and trust, and to look towards a leadership around the world that's actually calling for that. Countries that openly value well-being over economic growth, such as New Zealand, Iceland, Finland, countries like Taiwan, South Korea, and Singapore, who have been strict with quarantine enforcement, but also forthcoming with compensation for it. And of course, there's Cuba, a country that is managing the pandemic domestically, but also one that sends its own medical personnel to countries in need, be them rich countries or poor countries. So make no mistake, the world deals with many problems. COVID-19 is an enormous one, and if we're going to get through this and future crisis, we must find ways to take away the reward mechanism for misinformation and lies, and begin to build frameworks around problems, not enemies, and find incentive for truth, cooperation, and justice. And building this kind of understanding, well, that's why your professors made you write those essays, so you could get the skills, so we could value those skills. It's going to be the best medicine during the pandemics and other crises down the road. Thank you.
Thanks, Bob. That was great. And it takes us quite nicely to the exciting lie. So with that, I'll invite Mike to join us.
Thank you. That does fit in really nicely with a few things I want to talk about. And I want to start by saying information is hard. Like information is something that most people spend a lot of their time grappling with, either in the context of what they're studying, or like we have a whole degree program at Dal called a Master of Information, where 2 years in a graduate program, you study information and you learn a lot, but you come out of that going, wow, there's still so much I don't know. So I'm going to try to pull a few things out of what we study about the nature of information itself, and how that really changes the nature of truth, and how truth and information spreads in general in response to real world phenomena, but in particular in response to a pandemic. So I guess the first thing I want to say is the pace of information that we're getting is overwhelming, right? Everyone's talking about COVID-19. I can't remember a time when the Prime Minister and the premiers and the Public Health Authority were making daily announcements. And the announcements cover everything from health to the number of cases to efforts to help people economically. And so there's just a ton of information out there, and every one of those briefings generates articles and tweets. And the worst part of all of this information is we want to keep up with it, right? Our brains are wired to pay attention to things that are changing quickly, and to watch the thing that is changing and to try to make some sense of it, to find some pattern. That's natural, that's normal. And when the information that we're seeing makes us angry or scared or sad, we pay more attention to it. We devote more of our time to it. It's part of our fight or flight response. We're seeing something that we're worried is going to harm us, and we're studying it to figure out how we can respond effectively. It's natural. It's part of how our brains are wired, but our brains didn't evolve in a world with Twitter or other social media or 24-hour cable news. So just to give you a sense of the numbers, there's about 5 million tweets a day about COVID-19. There's been over 500 million tweets on that subject so far. Some of them are accurate and some of them are not. But what I can tell you for sure is there's no way to keep up with that. That's just one social media platform. And so I guess my advice to you is that if you're struggling with information and what to do with truth and how to find truth and facts, is to say, first, stop, breathe. It's okay. You don't have to read everything. This isn't something where making sure that you read the latest hot take is going to make you safer. I don't think that a permanent retreat from information is necessary or even helpful. But you do need to manage your information diet very carefully and deliberately. Pick a few resources that you trust and focus on those. Balance it to get some. Emma talked about one type of balance, right? How the story is being framed, and that's an interesting way to balance your diet. Building on Bob's comments, you can balance it by looking both locally and regionally and nationally and internationally. You can balance it by looking at pieces that talk not only about the human impact, but also about the future and how the next 6 months might look, and limiting your consumption. Don't over consume information. And I should say, if you find that you're overwhelmed by anxiety or that you're really struggling with this, don't be reluctant to get help. This is something that we know happens, that this kind of information overload can prompt a mental health crisis. And I just want to make sure that if you're feeling that you're looking for your local mental health supports, whether that's a phone line or someone in person, and making sure that you're reaching out. The second challenge of information that I want to talk about is how the truth, the simple fact, can be so boring compared to the exciting untruth, right? So if I tell you that dandelion tea will cure COVID-19, that's exciting. That's a hard fact. That's something I can hang my hat on. That's something that makes me feel protected. Suddenly you can't wait for dandelions to show up in your lawn this spring. But because I'm making it up, I can say whatever I want. I can back that up with all of the information. I can tell you that doctors in Italy are growing dandelions in hospital sinks so that they can treat their patients, right? I can make it up. And they're not, by the way. This isn't real. But how do you respond to that using facts and science? Well, what we can say definitively is we don't know if dandelion tea is a cure or not. There have been no studies that demonstrate that it's a cure. There's no evidence that it's a cure, but that's boring. Who's going to share that, right? The only motive to share that is to get good information out there. It's not nearly as motivating as an excitement or an emotional response. And so the false information, because it's exciting, is more likely to be spread far and wide and to go viral, a phrase I hesitate to use when talking about information in a pandemic. The boring truth simply doesn't win in a fair fight. And to make matters worse, good science and good medicine is constantly changing as we learn new information. And so sometimes the latest good information contradicts yesterday's or last week's or last month's good information. And so my advice here is the stronger your emotional response to a piece of information, the more you should think twice before you believe it, and certainly before you share it. That's not to say that there aren't things that are true that will also evoke an emotional response. I think that we should just learn to associate that emotional response with a trigger for our critical thought, even though those two things don't always go together so all that well. And finally, information has certain properties, right? And we work in a university environment, and we work in all educational environments to try to help people identify when information is of good quality and when it's not, when it's a reputable source and when that source isn't reputable. And some of the signals that we use are changing. So, for example, the idea of information changing rapidly is sometimes a signal that information isn't true. But in the context of a rapidly evolving and changing pandemic, that signal isn't as reliable as it once was. And the same thing is true about the source of the information. So one thing about the pandemic is there's a lot of smart people who can't do or choose not to do what they normally do. And so they're talking about COVID-19. But they don't all know about disease and immunology or epidemiology, the study of the spread of disease. And so even well-intended smart people doing things that they understand well, like crunching numbers, can also spread bad information. And so people that we've come to trust as a reputable source of information about, say, the likelihood of the Montreal Canadiens making the playoffs are now offering opinions on the progression of a pandemic. And that's a big shift. And it's not clear that someone who's normally a reputable source is in this case. I like to point to the Elon Musk example, right? A famous smart person, made money by being smart, launching rockets into space and building self-driving cars. Those are smart things that people do. But it doesn't study pandemics or the spread of disease, and it has in fact been sharing information so false that the links don't even work anymore because Google and Twitter have shut them down because they're trying to stop the spread of misinformation on their platforms. And so smart people aren't smart about everything, and that's changing how we assess the quality of information that we're consuming. And we're being asked to do many, many, many new things during this pandemic. And one of them is how we assess the quality of information. There's lots of great fact-checking sites out there. Snopes is working overtime on this. There's a dedicated Canadian site, COVID-19misinfo.org, that's tracking COVID-related false information. And if you have questions, there are usually answers that will help you find where the truth and where the fact lies in the information that you're seeing. I'll leave it at that.
Thanks, Mike. So now it's time to turn the conversation over to those who are watching. I'm looking forward to seeing the questions that you have. So here's one from Jennifer. How do you suggest balancing the need to take in a variety of media sources to avoid bias with the need to limit the amount of news being taken in to protect mental health?
I'm looking at Emma, in case you're wondering.
Yeah.
All right, I'll give it a whirl.
We'll work out the kinks on the Facebook stare here.
Okay. So, I mean, I think that's a really important question. I have to admit that doing the research I was doing for this talk, I felt myself getting very depressed. And I felt like I had to kind of watch and read every news story that came down the pike. And I watch a lot of news as it is and read a lot of news as it is. I think you just, sometimes you have to take a break. But what I try and do, and I think this sort of relates to both the other guests' comments, what I try and do when I'm trying to figure out what's going on in the news is I look for common threads across sources that don't normally agree with one another. So if, the National Post, the Toronto Star, and the Globe and Mail all feature the same fact, now it might be wrong, but it's less likely to be wrong than if only the National Post or the Toronto Star do it, right? So that's why I like looking at lots of different sources. I'm less likely to get kind of led down the garden path. Now, that said, there are some stories that came out that were repeated over and over again, as we've seen already in this discussion. I'm thinking of the ibuprofen story, the story that ibuprofen could make the symptoms worse. I mean, I think it was the health minister in France that first put that out on Twitter. And it got picked up in the media, and everybody published it. So I was reading that and thinking, I better avoid ibuprofen. And then later on, it turned out to be, iffy, claim at best. So, like Mike was saying, I think the information evolves. If something is a blatant lie, and you follow the news across a bunch of sources, often the fact that it's a blatant lie will come out somewhere eventually. Have a hermeneutic of suspicion, as we call it in sociology, about everything, right? Interpret everything with a little bit of suspicion. And I think that's the way that I approach the news anyway. Don't believe everything you read, I guess, if that helps at all. I don't know if that helps your mental health, though.
I like the analogy of portion control, where yes, it's hard to eat carrots when there's so much pizza in the world, but it's okay to eat a little bit of both. And so not binging on social media, or for example, and focusing your social media on those reputable sources, or filtering out COVID-19 entirely from your social media. Most of these platforms have a way to completely filter based on keywords and get all of your information about it from elsewhere. All of these would be ways to control the portion size that you're getting from these different media channels.
Thanks. Let me ask you another question here. I can see it doesn't seem to be popped up, but I can see it in my line. So here's one. We get a limited amount of international news in Canada. Should we be worried about what's happening in other non-US, non-EU countries? After all, isn't a pandemic global? Maybe I'll ask you to kick off that one, Bob.
Sure. Yes, of course. We should be very concerned about the health consequences of this pandemic around the world. I mean, the pandemic has shown that it has complete disregard for borders. And as such, it's going to be an invitation for both political leaders, for the international community and for individuals, citizens, consumers of media to not just frame it within national boundaries. One of the problems that comes out every now and then in the US media, I think in response to such poor leadership in the White House, has been trying very eagerly to compare what's Finland doing, what's Sweden doing, what's the UK doing. And they're sort of talking about different responses, kind of like moving chess pieces around on a board. Well, it's too late. It's too downstream from that. And I think if there's any indication of what we should be taking away from how other nations are responding to it, is actually to see how they're treating not the disease, not illness, but health itself. In many ways, these sanctions, well, they are, I guess, but the quarantines, the cordon sanitaire, the isolation, these are the general guidelines that have been put out. And every nation has imposed them and is responding to them very differently. In places that have means and resources that can compensate people for going into these conditions, it's working out better. In places that are struggling economically, where there's marginalization, where there's massive inequality, a shelter-in-place order in a slum in Calcutta is going to have very different consequences than you would in Hollywood. So that's, I think, what we need to take away is not just how are people reacting to this, but really what's the vision that other countries, other societies have about health more generally.
Thanks, Bob. Here's one from Kevin. Should a broadcast network refuse to air Trump's COVID briefings if it is believed that the president is providing misleading or dangerous statements? What is the ruling principle that should be at work?
I'm going to go, yeah. I mean, I'm going to go straight up yes on this. That's a hard yes. The amount of disinformation, just the off the cuff misleading one-offs that the president does is harmful. People follow this guy's word carefully, and we've seen reactions in the streets in U.S. capitals where people are out there not just breaking isolation bans, but protesting quite violently about it. So I think there needs to be some level of responsibility to say that this is a very special period. Pandemics are not a daily event. They're a once in every 100 years event. And when it comes to it, the ability to just say what you want without consequence has to be reconsidered. We're talking about people's health, and we're talking about maintaining well-being of society. And if you have a leader who can't tell night from day, there should be consequences for that.
Yeah, I'm not sure about that. I mean, I think for entertainment value, the Trump briefings are interesting, but I think what's really crucial is that you have people there that can counter the things that he's saying. You can't muzzle the guy, unfortunately. And we have daily briefings from many politicians in many different, parts of the world. So I don't, it's a tricky one to know what to do with Trump. Nobody knows what to do with Trump, I think. But at the very least, you have to have a lot of critical commentary going on in the media when he's coming out with blatant untruths on a daily basis.
Right. Is there a risk, though, Emma, that if you've got someone who is taking to a podium with a lot of media attention, giving out misinformation, that challenges directly one of the key tenets of public health, which is the consistency and clear messaging? That even if there are officials, if it's Fauci or if it's the CDC, who are there to say, nope, that was wrong. Now that this is out in the world, can it now invite some sort of a bias assimilation where people can start challenging the different sentiments based on non-facts?
Right. I mean, the thing about Trump is that he takes to Twitter when he wants to say something. So I don't think there is any way to shut him up. I think the only thing to do is to provide plenty of critical commentary. The thing is, what worries me is that anything Trump says, no matter how many times it's counteracted, people who want to believe Trump will believe Trump. And so this is the kind of choosing of the news source problem that I was talking about. If we can get people to look at different kinds of news stories, so not just Fox News, but MSNBC, right? Then people are going to get a more complicated picture. But there's this siloizing of news right now that means that people are getting one message all the time from the sources that they're looking at. So they believe it.
Maybe let me change a little bit here and ask if we should worry about what's happening in other news. So Emma, your study suggested that the vast majority of the front page news that we're getting at least is about COVID. What does that mean about what's left? Mike, one of your suggestions was people might weed out the COVID reading that they're doing and focus on other things for a while as a way of giving themselves a break. What do you think?
Yeah, I wouldn't want to retreat entirely from consuming information about this. I think given enough time that a dearth of information would be anxiety inducing on its own. But I do think that there will be times where we will all need time to cleanse our palates, if you will, from the nonstop spread of news, and focus on something that's different. Just to not think about it for a little while.
Yeah, I think that kind of combo of not just reading about COVID, and it's good for us, not just because we find out about other things that are going on in the world, but it is a bit of a mental health break too.
So here's a question from Tamana. How to determine which sources among Canadian news media to go out for when there are so many options on a provincial and national level, especially for international students who have been very recently introduced to media outlets?
Yeah, I mean, I think you're spoiled for choice, really. There are plenty of Canadian news media outlets. Again, I like that. I mean, that there is no allsides.com for Canada at the moment, as far as I know. It would be great if there was, where you could see different sort of stories from different political persuasions across the spectrum of news coverage. But I guess that would be my recommendation, is to pick papers that represent a range. So, I mean, the Globe and Mail I would characterize as sort of red Tory sort of a paper. And the Toronto Star as a more left-wing paper. And so they tend to cover quite different stories. Globe and Mail covers more international stories, I find, than either the National Post or the Toronto Star are the ones that I looked at. And then, but you don't get much local news. So it depends what you're after. But I think at the very least, it's useful for people to read a news story that doesn't always fit their political biases.
Maybe I can squeeze one more in here before we have to wrap up. What are some of the ways the members of the public can influence accountability for agencies and individuals spreading misinformation? Maybe I'll ask each of you to take that one on, because I can see how each of your comments actually was connected in some ways to that question.
Who's going first? Mike.
I think the individual one is a challenging one, especially in a world where we aren't talking to people in person, right? Saying to your friend in person over coffee, hey, what's this nonsense you've been sharing on Facebook lately, is a very different conversation than saying on Facebook, what is this nonsense you've been sharing on Facebook lately? And that's complicating our response to the individuals who are spreading misinformation. But when they're individuals that are known to us, having that kind of conversation, if you believe it will be effective, is a normal and healthy part of relationships. To say, I'm uncomfortable with some of the things that you're sharing, and where are you getting this information, and can we talk? As awkward as those conversations are, I think that for long-term relationships, they're especially important. It's also possible that there are individuals who you do not believe will stop spreading misinformation, and I think then the only dietary advice I can give you on that information is to stop consuming it. And accountability for agencies is certainly a much bigger question. Our mechanism for holding our government agencies accountable is through the political process, and so that involves elections and speaking to our elected leaders. That's where the accountability flows through, and that is an enormously complex and difficult and fraught way of holding an agency accountable. But it is, I think, ultimately a good one, in that it relies on a tried and tested and approach to managing accountability in the public sector. Where I'll stop there, other than to say that there's a whole other hour-long thing we could do on governments and accountability. Great.
I think the question is when you're exposed to information or misinformation, the question is, why are you being exposed to it? The source of any sort of information, if it is, you have to be, again, vigilant. And as Emma said, hone in that little bit of suspicion as well. Is this information being told to me for my benefit? Is it being told to me for someone else's benefit? Or is it being told so I don't blame someone else for that information? And I think that's sort of the thing we got to be aware of. And if you feel that you're in a situation where there's doubt, there probably is doubt. And that's where we need to home in on our good old-fashioned research skills, cite your sources, check your facts. And it might be an annoying process to do, but if something really is worth having a conversation about or against, then that's where to start. I mean, just as some of the points here were mentioned about how Elon Musk needed to cite his sources better, and our government officials in France, same deal. Unfortunately, this is going to be part of the exercise for the next little while.
Yeah, and I guess just to echo a couple of points that have already been made in a different way, vote. As Mike's sort of implying, that's one way to kind of make your voice heard. Also, I think subscribing to news sources that are providing really solid, responsible coverage. News sources, newspapers in particular, are really struggling right now. And their advertising revenue has gone down, even though they're getting more clicks than ever, because nobody wants their product associated with coronavirus, right? So if you find that coverage is really balanced and really sound, subscribe to that paper. And the other thing I do in terms of individuals is I refer people to Snopes.com a lot. And even though I do that fairly often, I'm surprised at how few people know about Snopes.com. So if you read something on your Twitter feed or your Instagram or whatever that you think sounds a bit wonky, look it up on Snopes. And 9 times out of 10, there'll be something on Snopes about it. So it's a great resource, as Mike said.
So thanks to Emma, Robert, and Mike for their time today. That's all the time that we've got for this edition of the Open Dialogue Live events, but we're back again next week, so please join us. And a special thanks to our awesome interpreter, Karina, and to all of you who took the time to tune in today. Stay well and take care.
Thanks.